Good morning, everyone. I am the last Omnitech, your favorite robot American, and welcome to the next episode of OMNI Draws. This time, running something a little bit interesting. So, for those of you who are unaware, normally I draw my webcomics on these streams. But, as of today, there are 94 days remaining until my Legacy First Flight Alpha, as decreed by me, demanding that I give myself a timeline or else I'll never achieve anything. So, today is actually a little bit of an OMNI Draws and a little bit of something I just started on my other channel, Unicorn Head Studios, OMNI Makes, namely Legacy First Flight. So, everybody sit back, relax, as we kick off a little bit more work. I hope you're all ready to get to it because it's drawing time, baby. Also, let me just pop on over and gotta test the face cam. We all know it wouldn't be a stream if I didn't have some technical issues. There we are. No matter what I do, I always have to refresh that. Of course I cook in time for stream. This is the way. This is the way. This is the way. Also, before I go any further, I should probably, there we go. Fix that logo in the top right corner. So, today is it is the 94th day remaining before I launch Legacy First Flight's beta. I guess it would be a beta. You guys have been playing the alpha on stream. So, the closed beta on my little Patreon, speaking of, if anyone out there is interested in supporting the channel, patreon.com/TheLastOmnitect. We do TTRPGs. I do YouTube. I do webcomics. You can get my webcomics early. You can get my TTRPG stuff and unique stuff for it solely on that site, as well as also free access to a number of my projects as they come along. Huge thanks, as always, to Ampersand, Atlas, Heinrich, Necronomus, Souls Rolls, and the incredible Mossy the Mighty. Thank you all, and thank you, Patreon. Your crew is awesome. You make me amazing. You guys, as my patrons, keep me afloat. So, getting back to it. Today, we kick off something. Why is the camera still doing that? It's being weird. I don't know why the camera's being weird. It had to manually restart it every time. So, I have been working non-stop the past couple of days on getting the rules ready for production, getting the rules ready to go. I have a meeting tomorrow with a friend who is a publisher, and we will see about getting the work published and what I need to do to make that happen. But in the meantime, I gotta get everything else set up. So I'm gonna start drawing assets for the book. I've already been doing this for quite some time, but now it's time to focus on bespoke pieces of art for a bespoke game. So, without further ado, we're going to draw a piece of art that I want to have splashed across 2 pages. This is going to be interesting. So, everyone get ready. Here we go. So right now, this is the little template that I have. Today we're going to be drawing the first of 2 species, but before we do that, I need to make sure I have this properly fixed up in terms of canvas size. So my canvas normally sits at a letterhead page, which is basically your standard printer paper. Makes things really convenient and easy for anyone who wants to print this thing out, which I want people to be able to print this out and just read it on their PDF readers and the usual. So this means that I want to do a double splash page, which means we get to split this, and this is going to be going to resize the canvas. We're going to take this, and this is the width of the document, and we're going to do a little fast math. 2,550 times 2. So starting from the back and moving forward, that's 100 times 2 on the 5 gets you to, in this case, 100, and I believe that'd be, should be 1,100 times 2, so that's 5,100, I believe. Just going to be absolutely sure about that, but I'm pretty confident I just nailed that. Oh, hold on. Let's see. Blah. This thing is, of course, being a butt. Instantly. Instantly becomes a butt. Okay. Oh, that's why. It's doing this stupid thing. I just need a standard calculator, man. I was like, wait, why is that being so difficult? 5,100. I nailed it. Okay. This is one of those, I still don't want to fuck it up, so we're just gonna do this right. And I will expand this from the left-hand side. Okay, yeah, that's good enough. This should be right. Wait, why is it taller? That's not correct. Oh, I think I see what happened. I expanded the document, but I locked that. Ah, whoops. Let's fix that. Same thing, resize. That's more like it. Let's go. Don't like what it did to my watermark there. No, that was weird. That's a little more like it. I'm gonna take that, flip it. It's looking okay now. We're looking all right. I'm probably gonna like slightly re-angle that a little, but it'll do. Okay. So we're just gonna take that, disappear it for a minute. So this is going to be the beginning of the art splash, 5,100. Yeah, I saw that. I'm sorry. I'm 37, and I'm trying to make sure that I keep my mind intact, which means occasionally doing basic arithmetic in my head and then double-checking. So, as I do this double splash, we're going to be focusing on one particular species in Legacy. That today is going to be the Acryss. So, the Acryss as a species are one of the first I actually made in Legacy. So much so that their initial art goes all the way back to its founding. I have unfortunately always disliked the way I drew the Acryss, which is one of those moments where I get to remind everybody, don't throw away your old art. You'll never know when it's convenient or helpful for you. But I have some of the newer art that I can show you all. So without further ado, the Acryss. So, I'm going to read very quickly out of the actual core book, out of the core rulebook, and let you guys hear a little bit of their lore before we start drawing them. So, the Acryss. Let's make sure I've got this correct. Yeah, it looks like it's all set. Alright. The Acryss, saviors, first found, keepers of the realm. One of the two founding species of the Union, the peoples of the Acryss stratocracy are known for their hawkish countenance, swift wings, and alarming physical strength. Voluntarily uplifted from their Stone Age by the Anazali remnant to fight in the skyless war against the Ataraxi scourge, the Acryss have maintained the single largest interstellar military body in the galaxy ever since, and their technological prowess is only exceeded by the Anazali themselves. Despite these advantages, they still suffer from a significant cultural stunting brought on by their sudden ascendancy into a spacefaring species. Physically, the Acryss stand between 7 and 9 feet, or 215 to 275 centimeters, in height, and are typically on a rather slender predatory build. Their bodies are covered in a thick layer of colorful feather plumage that can both provide warmth at higher elevation and compress to reduce drag during flight, and have numerous fin-like control surfaces on their hips, ankles, and the sides of their sleek heads. Bright eyes shine from a hawkish face adorned with a sharp beak that itself conceals a separate row of serrated teeth, and crowned with rows of soft, pliable quills that hang from the back of their heads like hair. What at first glance seems to be only arms extend large pinions outward on the wrist, revealing their arms to be massive wings with a full wingspan approaching 20 feet or 610 centimeters. Their hands and feet are dexterous talons, tipped with sharpened claws, capable of fine manipulation as well as savage displays of strength. Their limbs possess enough flexibility and speed to effortlessly swap between using hands and feet to use tools and carry weapons while in flight. Bound by ancient oaths of honor, venerating the spirits of their Stone Age ancestors, and mixing their ancient tribal heritage with some of the most advanced technology in the galaxy, the Acryss are a unique people. Valiant and skillful, with a noble bearing, and a bit of a savior complex from having literally saved the galaxy from certain destruction, and Acryss is a valuable friend. That is our summary. And so, I get to draw these guys. They're pretty fun. I've only ever drawn a couple of them in full body, and that's simply just because their physiology is rather difficult to draw. Move this a little out of the way, I don't know why it's not on the side. Here we go. So, one of the oldest pieces of concept art I actually have is actually a really, this is 5 years ago. Ugh. So this was an old doodle I did of the Acryss. I don't like the proportions of the head, and it feels a little too cartoony, but it gives you a rough idea of their physiology. They have wings on their ankles, wings on their waists, and their primary wings on their actual forearms. They bear a lot in common with bats, in a way, more than birds. They're less falcon-like in many ways than you'd think, but that'll do well enough. Likewise, also, we have one other final piece of art that I've drawn, which is actually something that's rather interesting. It's actually about a combat encounter, I believe. Here we go. So, get that watermark out of the way. This is an Acryss soldier, clad in hardlight, which is a whole thing that the Acryss have. So the Acryss are actually one of the two most advanced species in the galaxy at the time, and no small part of that is due to their access when they were uplifted to Anazali technology, which they swiftly refined. They focused their studies primarily on light and the manipulation of it, and as a result, the Acryss as a species have probably the single greatest optical science, optical science understanding of anyone in the Union. Hands down, their ability to bend and manipulate light approaches magical. And so they actually, for the most part, for their armor, don't wear normal armor. They wear hard light, which is incredibly lightweight, and while it's dependent on an energy source, incredibly resilient. It also allows them to adapt it at speed. So Acryss armor is almost always shifting and moving around to where it's most useful. Their weapons, likewise, often use caged light and laser weaponry. So this gives us an idea of how they fight. Now, one of the big things with the Acryss is that because of the fact that they do fly, they have to work in a couple of, we have to work with a couple of things. One, the Acryss as a species actually need assistance flying on most worlds. Still makes me think of Mass Effect Sentinel armor. I won't pretend that wasn't inspiration. I'm willing to wear my inspiration on my sleeve. I'm not above that. One of the big tricks with the Acryss in terms of how they sort of operate in flight is that on other worlds, while they require assistance, they can. Quite well, actually. Usually by using gravity anchors. As we open this up to take a look. So, it's hard to see here. The spacesuit actually has, shielding that goes over their entire wing compartment. Most Acryss actually have these little devices implanted inside of their wings, which are known as gravity anchors, or gravity boosters. Gravity anchors are basically devices designed to create an anti-gravity field to negate the effect of gravity. Anti-gravity thrusters actually create thrust, so they create a directional pull of gravity that is independent from a local gravity field, thus generating mostly thrust on the individual in question that's being targeted by the gravity drive. Whereas a gravity anchor kind of just acts like a ballast against gravity's effects. It isn't capable of truly generating thrust, only negating the local effect of gravity. So most Acryss utilize gravity anchors in order to lighten their weight on other worlds, or at very least help negate the issues they might have in flight. They're still pretty strong, and in fact, roughly weigh about as much as your average human. So they stand anywhere from 125 to 220 pounds on an aggregate. Some can get all the way up to 250, and there are some that can push 300, but it's very rare. Most Acryss, in order to be flight capable on their home world, usually have to be within 100 to 200 pounds. Anything over that, you start reaching a serious issue with drag and thrust. So if their home world wasn't particularly low gravity, they wouldn't be able to fly in other worlds at all. They've also slightly tinkered with themselves ever since they left their homeworld. So let's start working on a background here. We'll start just doing a little bit of fun. We'll have a little bit of fun sketching some of this stuff out. Here we go. Okay, and then over the top of this, I'm just going to do a big sketchy. I'm just going to call this the sketch line. I'm thinking of drawing the interior of a starship or some kind of structure. So let's start with some quick doodles. Beautiful. Okay. So I'm thinking that we're going to have text filling up this area here, more or less. Probably talking about the different advantages and stuff the species has. Up here we're going to have something just so that I can probably like the big title, and probably like a little blurb right down here. And we might actually even have the stats like right here. There's not too many to the actual like block of stats required, but this is just so that I can properly like pinion out where there's going to be stuff in the way. Just that way I don't make too much detail that's going to be missed. And I also need to put a big dividing line right down the middle. Okay, we're going to do that by... hello? No. It's not what I wanted. There we go. That is decidedly not what I wanted. There we are. Ha! That is dead middle, the center of the page. Beautiful. And now I can take that and center it. Alignment. Align. Middle. We'll go align center. There we are. Perfect. So this gives me a pretty good idea of what people are going to be looking at on the page. Just to make things simple for me when I'm doing this. So I'm just going to call this blocking for now. Page blocking. And I'm going to go back onto our sketch here. And all this area here is going to be blacked out completely, so I can sort of just see where the text is, or where it's going to go. I've debated creating symbols for each species, but I don't know about that. I'll feel it out. If I come across some designs I really like, I'll go with it. But the biggest issue I have with that is what like emblems would I use? Probably the emblems of their homeworlds, but not everyone has clear and obvious emblems for them. As an example, the Shrike just don't. They have almost nothing in common with each other. I suppose the closest thing would be their glyph for the name of their homeworld, but that hardly feels like... That'd be like if I just wrote the word Earth as the symbol for humanity. It would be very weird. Okay. Yeah, that'll do. Alright, so this gives me an idea of what stuff is going to be and where. Make another one, and this is going to be concepting. Okay. So we have our page blocking. We can reduce the opacity on that, just so I have an idea of what I'm working with. Down to like an 11 will do fine. Cool. Just going to save this. And I'm going to start a new thing. This is going to be the actual sketch. Okay. Symbols is interesting because that's an easy way to add a tag to equipment if it has the symbol. That's true, but I'm not sure how complex they would be, or if they would be small enough, like if I could shrink them, you know? Different species use different, their languages are more complex. For the Shrike, as an example, they basically write in some equivalent of Braille, so it becomes more difficult to use that. I'm not sure how well that would work, but it's an interesting idea. So let's get to the actual doodad here. I'm going to start with like a 45 and go from here. So my thought is we're just going to have a large, like, some sort of large amphitheater. Or a large room. Kind of like the idea of having like a large window or something equivalent to it. The Acryss are very vertical. Unlike a lot of other species, more than almost any other species, the Acryss are vertical in their construction. The only species that comes even close would probably be the Shrike, because they climb so much, and because of the fact that they build a lot of large residence chambers into their architecture as just a baseline. So let's see. I'm thinking we're going to have... really don't like how this is not working correctly. Okay. Yeah, it keeps doing that. I don't like that. Yeah, what the heck? Might be time for me to start getting a new tablet. Hard to tell. Okay, there we go. So we have a couple of these up here. Large vaulted ceilings. And then into the distance. I like their architecture to be a little more elvish, almost, in structure. Because I think that's very important for me. It gives them a very natural kind of aesthetic. So I tend to use rounded shapes and things like that. But not too rounded. I think Protoss is the best example of what I have. Of, like, what their architecture would be. So you have this large chamber. I kind of like the idea that they don't make it, like... They make it very easy for folks to fly through. And I kind of like the idea also that a lot of their entrances also have these, like, panes to rest on. So someone who's, like, going from room to room, they can literally just sort of stoop there and relax. And then we just sort of continue that off into the distance. There we go. I'm going to shrink that a little bit more. There we go. So we've got this very big, almost hallway-like structure. Don't like how it's not responding. It's like the sensitivity's been turned all the way down. It's probably from the latest update. Thanks, Windows. Here we go. Honestly, Elven fits. Yeah, I feel like it does. Given that these guys are literally the second oldest remaining species in the galaxy in terms of how everything's kind of gone and worked out, yeah, I think that's pretty fair for them. And then up on the top, we're just going to make it so that the actual ceiling is the darkest part. That and the distant entrance. I kind of like the idea that they're looking out into space, or the moon. So let's do that. Let's make this a nice dark thing. Like, mostly dark with, like, a very bright moon coming through it. And then over here, I'm going to take these and sort of reinforce them a little bit. We'll do the same thing on this side. Okay. So you've got some general structures here. I actually kind of like the idea of... Let's remove these entirely. These spars were a cool idea to a degree, but then I realized, like, I think it's just going to get in the way. Here we go. Okay. And then up here, we're going to just have this thing. So we have a doorway here. Probably going to go even further back than that. We'll do the same thing. We're going to sort of just add a little bit of darkness onto the ceiling. And we do the same thing on this side. Here we go. And then we're going to have Acryss, I figure, like, just sort of looking over a platform or something in the foreground. So, let's take ourselves a nice round thing. Move it over a little bit. I don't want to block too much out. I want to give the Acryss, like... I want the Acryss to be front and center. So, let's put that there. And have some... I'm going to put this at 75, so it's very obvious. Here we go. we sort of just have our shapes here. And we're just sort of working out some very rough silhouettes here. And I kind of like the idea of having like an Acryss's face like up close, sort of like just looming over the platform. Here we go. And we sort of give them... I like to give them these sort of like shoulder poofs a little bit, where they almost have this... it's almost kind of like they've got shoulder pads built into the crests of their upper arms. I just think that's very fun for them. Here we go. And usually I'll give them like particularly long crests or stuff like that, just for the fun of it. There we are. Okay, that'll do. And I'm going to put this at... let's make it 45%. Just so I can have a good silhouette of what I'm working with here. And we can mostly black this out. There we go. And this little dude over here will be in a slightly darker shade, but not in the darkest possible thing. Here we go. Usually whenever I draw Acryss, I actually make them mostly black-feathered, but they come in all varieties, so it's not just one or the other. Here we go. Foreground, Acryss. Here we go. So the Acryss are an interesting species, generally speaking, from a playing standpoint. For starters, their culture is very unique compared to most of the other species. And that's because their culture is very primitive. Acryss are basically a Stone Age species masquerading as a spacefaring species. And that's not necessarily fair to them either. It's not their fault. The Anazali themselves will own this bone quite readily, that it's their fault. When the Ataraxi Scourge scoured the galaxy, they were kind of torn. They stumbled across the Acryss and realized they were being tracked by the Ataraxi Scourge, and these creatures literally destroy all life they come in contact with. Normally, a spacefaring species is the big threat, but, you know, the likelihood they just sort of stumble onto a Stone Age species and obliterate it is very low. But, having parked themselves over their world to, like, realize that there's a sapient species there, the Acryss kind of damned them. So they were either stuck with, or I should say, the Anazali were kind of damning them. So they just sort of decided, we either leave the Acryss to die and hope the Ataraxi Scourge pass them over and don't attack them because they're not spacefaring, to sort of write them off, or we uplift them and give them a means to hopefully at least die on their feet. And the Acryss surprised them and didn't just die on their feet, but actually won. More than even the Anazali could have ever hoped. So this is kind of what makes the Acryss so intriguing. This species was literally in its Stone Age. It's very early, at very most, like, primitive Bronze Age. Probably not even there. We're probably talking, like, God. It is, like, late Stone Age, I guess early Bronze Age, in that ballpark. So, they kind of went into space before they did all those cultural leaps everyone else did. We, between banging rocks and spears together, but there's a lot of time between Mesopotamia and human spaceflight, as it is now. We've had a lot of time in that to develop culture, to go through several thousand revolutions, to develop our own internal shared structure of language and shared structure of politics and belief, to have religions develop and build. And as a result, from a cultural standpoint, the Acryss seem... They're not hollow, but very much they are built around the idea that all they had when they became an uplifted species, literally within one generation going from Stone Age level warfare and exploration to actual spacefaring, that they grabbed what culture they had and lionized it. So the Acryss are one of the only species in the galaxy that are animist. And that's because for them, their religion started as animism. Their faith in spirits is derived very much from that. It's not that it's a primitive concept, but it's simply where they were at the time. There's plenty of different types of religion on Earth, but most religions tend to descend from some variety of animism or spiritual worship of physical objects. To some degree. It's just a very logical progression from a cultural standpoint. To go, hey, what are we going to worship? Well, the sun is literally always in the sky every day. So we should worship that, because it keeps us warm and it keeps our crops going. And the Acryss kind of never got over that. They literally got brute forced into spaceflight. And since then, they've kind of denoted that. They venerate their ancestors for making this glorious last stand that turned into saving the galaxy for them and for everyone else. So as a result, most Acryss put a lot of emphasis on their cultural heritage, even though it is, by their own admission, somewhat primitive. One of the examples of that would be their ties to major tribal lines. The Acryss very much are obsessed with their own ancestry. Many would say to their own detriment. For them, they actually treat the ancestral lines that their individual ancestors come from as almost like a horoscope, in a way. So, there's 5 major tribal lines that are still persist this day, like up till now, in terms of what they... How do I describe this? In terms of, like, actually having survived with some degree of knowledge on them. There were plenty of other Acryss tribes. These are the Acryss that survived. So they call the Skyless War the Skyless War because that was what their Stone Age ancestors considered space. Literally a battle in a sky without air. And that to them just sort of flew in the face of... I mean, you try to explain the concept of outer space to someone who's just starting to grasp basic, like, not even calculus yet. We're talking, like, the most primitive of mathematics. Useful, incredibly interesting, but, like, if I pulled Jules Verne out and I was like, hey, man, there's these things called pulsars out there. They're super cool. Pretty sure Jules Verne's head would have exploded. You know? We literally perceived the idea of the ether, which is like, you know, that, the idea of the ether persisted pretty much all the way through Flash Gordon and that era. It wasn't until recently that we discovered that there is no, like, there is an interstellar medium, but it's not breathable, and it sure as hell isn't the ether, and in fact, actually, that whole concept we had about how the universe worked was wrong. That's modern humans. Now imagine caveman. That's kind of what happened with the Acryss. So for them, in the Skyless War, before they actually took off to fight in space, the Acryss came to a realization, which is if they were fighting an existential war against a threat that could kill all of them, which they were, make no mistake, the Anazali absolutely did manipulate them into that fight, not gleefully, for the record. They realized how fucked it was, but they did so under no false pretenses. They really did say, we kind of fucked you all. This is, you either fight or you're probably going to get annihilated. Sorry. And that was true. So the Acryss realized they were going into a state of total war, which means they needed allies. And either they would have allies, or they would have enemies. So there is a brief period before they took off into space where the Acryss engaged in a massive, very brief intertribal war, which basically built all the battle lines for those who were willing to fight and those who were going to be integrated into the fight. The Acryss are not proud of that era, but they acknowledge that it was probably necessary in order to save their species, because they didn't have time for a proper consensus, and many of the different species and nations of the Acryss at that time, they didn't really have a structure designed to gather a planet's worth of people. That type of political infrastructure takes time to build. It takes generations. The Acryss had, at most, years. Just a couple of years. Basically, think Ender's Game. That was the level of readiness that they got themselves to in under 10 years. Which is unbelievably bad on a cultural level. So the Acryss accepted that. They had to accept that if this was going to happen. So, the Acryss made war amongst themselves. The tribes that remain afterward, plenty of client tribes, but the 5 first tribes that agreed to fight in the Skyless War are the Bladed Gale, the Lambent Moon, the Shadowed Canopy, the Soaring Spire, and the Endless Sea. These 5 tribes were the first 5 tribes contacted that agreed to fight. They were not allies, though some were closer, neighbors, something like allies. Akin to it, but not quite there yet. Some were vicious enemies, but they were the ones who agreed that annihilation was something worth fighting against. So they did. So the 5 tribes are kind of, in the modern day, hyper-romanticized by the average Acryss. There's a very strong leaning into a mythos of their own history. Which, in fairness, as an American, I can say, yeah, I empathize with them in that. The Acryss did something incredibly good in the past, and they've kind of never let anyone, especially themselves, live that down. And so for them, they don't look back on their ancestors as people to be pitied for having been uplifted into a war that they didn't make and they didn't deserve. Instead, they view their ancestors as heroic warriors, the perfect people positioned for the perfect moment to protect the galaxy. And in that way, they're also a little right, but it kind of misses some of the nuance. Likewise, they tend to romanticize a lot of the cultural traits of those 5 tribal lines. Hence why they're basically like a modern kind of horoscope. So, let's start with each of the different 5. We'll go through bit by bit. The Bladed Gale, as far as the Acryss go, were the first ones to pledge their warriors to fight against the Ataraxi, also known as the Outsiders to the Anazali. So, they were a very warlike clan. They were probably best compared with our modern conceptions of, I would say, like, early conquering roaming tribes that we would see amongst a lot of Indo-Europeans, as well as, like, Proto-Germanic tribes. So, groups like the Picts, as an example, we see a little bit of them in groups like the Apache, in groups like the Aztec, where their whole culture was built around constructing for them what was to be an empire. They were probably going to, if history hadn't swerved them onto an unbelievably weird twist of fate, they were probably going to be one of the first actual formalized nations of the Acryss. They had begun to conquer, began to set their eyes on their neighbors. They had a lot of focus, not simply on building weapons, but also on building political, like the beginning infrastructures for what you and I would consider a kingdom. And so, yeah, as a result, when the Anazali landed and said the world is going to die, the Bladed Gale were the first ones to say, well, that's not going to stand. We'll fight it. And if God's going to come down and kill us, we're going to kill God. And so they were the first to sign up for that. The Bladed Gale, they are oftentimes viewed as being renowned for their skill at arms. They're known for being chivalrous and noble and viciously skilled in combat, and being usually martially inclined. However, they're also known for their collective stubbornness and somewhat reckless nature. This is kind of this is the flip side of venerating your ancestors and their culture as social ideals. You venerate the good and the bad. For the Acryss, they very much have a perspective on these ancient, like, I guess you could say, almost religious archetypes, personality archetypes, in the same way that the West has created the romantic hero, and a lot of the relatively toxic tropes regarding that, off of our preconceived notions of what we would consider classical literature. Characters like Gilgamesh, like Perseus, like Hercules, who are both tragic and also endlessly mighty, are very much where the Bladed Gale draw their cultural energy from. Hey, Hickory Muffins, welcome to the stream. It's a pleasure to have you. We're just talking about the Acryss, one of the 8 playable species in Legacy that I'm currently drawing right here. And so we're talking about the Bladed Gale, which is one of the 5 primary traditional cultures in the Acryss, because they were a Stone Age species brute forced out of their Stone Age into spaceflight, uplifted to fight in a war that they didn't make, but needed to win or else they would die. Unfortunately, galaxy-wide genocide will do that. That's what happens when you unleash an alien species that literally is incapable of negotiation and will just assimilate you on a quantum level. Anyway, welcome aboard. And if you have any questions, please feel free. Same thing for everybody else. I'm just giving a brief overview. So, the Bladed Gale, like a lot of different cultures, both their tribal lineage, the people who call themselves from that, they venerate both the positive and negative traits in a romanticized way. This does not necessarily mean that they don't understand that there's limitations, but they view it as like the foibles of the perfect, like the perfect Acryss of their perfect tribe. Like, for them, it's an embodiment of those natures, and they view it as something noble. We would view it as enshrining negative traits into your character because someone a long time ago had them. But, you know, who doesn't still understand the concept that toxic masculinity persists in the modern age? In no small part because we refuse to acknowledge that some of that shit should be left in the past, right? So, as a result, those who are from the Bladed Gale not only tend to cultivate their skill at arms, even if they're not martial in their culture, like in their actual role in the military or their role in the government, as many of them are just, like most species, there's people. They're aliens, sure, but they're people. And so, the Bladed Gale, unfortunately, are one of those groups where, for them, like, they'll cultivate military prowess. They will become brave, and they'll, in fact, condition themselves to be brave, even when they're scared. They will oftentimes cultivate a stubborn nature. They'll cultivate reckless abandon and bravery, because for them, it's a virtue, not a vice. The Bladed Gale, however, are steadfast friends. They are incredibly passionate people. And I promise you, while they are reckless in many ways, they're reckless for people, usually. They give a damn. Truly they do. If you need to choose someone to be your pal in a rough situation, someone who venerates the Bladed Gale as their ancestral line is probably not a bad person. Thank you, Hickory Muffins. I appreciate that. Tradition is peer pressure from dead people. Ain't that the truth? Oof. Ouch, but true. I feel that in my Spanish bones. So, it also is important to denote this, which is the fact that each culture, when we talk about tribal lineages in the Acryss, because every species has their own denotation of, like, and this is just from a just a timeout here to pull you all back in very quickly. This is entirely a conceit of game design. When you're doing world building, I tend to, usually, build a pretty thick, dense lore book. I can absolutely chunk that shit up. I'm not quite Tolkien, where I can literally write an entire book about hiking that occasionally has some, like, violence in it. I have some limits, but I absolutely could write for days on treaties of, like, the minutiae of their culture. However, for the purpose of writing a tabletop role-playing game, one has to consider that you need to give players the information they need to get playing, and you can always give more later. And so, for the Acryss and every other species, I tend to have 5 focused on subcultures within their species. Not quite nations, because we're talking about interstellar species here, and interstellar species, describing them on a national front is kind of pointless when you're talking about a species that spans the stars, and thus these archetypes have to apply. The Acryss draw their lines culturally, to these ancient traditions. But the truth of the matter is, it has been over 2,000 years since the Acryss fought in the Skyless War. And so, as a result, anything they say about their lineage being derived from this one particular ancestor they're really proud of, they might have a legitimate claim to that ancestry, but if you don't know how genealogy works, in 2,000 years, that's enough time for basically everyone to become somewhat more intermingled. It is very likely that for most Acryss, they can draw pretty clear lineage lines where they actually have that data, because sometimes that shit gets mixed up by warfare and time and record keeping and death. So basically, some Acryss can reasonably draw a perfect lineage to multiple of these tribes. And the 5 big ones are just the 5 ones that they tend to focus on from a cultural standpoint. In the same way that if you ask any American, like, what's your preconceived notion about who people are after a certain, like, in the Wild West, inevitably you get the most racist perspectives and narrow, myopic vision of that era. Which is, 9 times out of 10, cowboys, Indians, outlaws, Mexicans. And I say this as a Southerner, alright? And I also say this as a Puerto Rican person who gets lumped in with, who unfortunately gets lumped in with every other Hispanic person who, growing up in the South, if you ever know or are aware of anything in the Caribbean, we share very little cultural DNA with each other, except for the fact that we all got the shit plundered out of us by the Spanish. So, this is kind of a whole thing for the Acryss. They pick and choose what culture they venerate. And that is an important thing. This is their cultural conceits, their cultural traditions. They are not built on rationality. I don't think that plays much of a point in what we're discussing here. I think this is a whole different ballgame. Also, I'm going to add this into like an extra layer, I think. I'm just going to sort of grab everything that's back here and put this on an interim background layer. Because I was looking at it, I was like, I want to add some detail here, but I also want to add a little more. Just grab this X and put that back here above, I guess, the background sketch. Yeah, that'll do. That's fine. Okay, so I can now turn that off, I hope. Wait, did I just not X that? Son of a gun. Okay, cool. Now I should be able to put that right there. Hey, Alex, good to see you, buddy. Much love. Hope you're doing well. So let's see. With enough evidence or justification, you can claim a lot of different heritages. Yeah, ask anyone who's ever taken one of those genetic tests about where they're from. What it usually reveals is that we have no idea what our cultural heritage is. 9 times out of 10, people are not who they think they are. Because oftentimes that shit's constructed from year to year, generation to generation, to be who people want to be. And there's nothing wrong with that. It can, unfortunately, lead to people being left out and cultures being erased, which is really not cool. But at the same time, people invent themselves, and people invent their own legends and history, as much as history does. So, sounds like my friend, yeah. You know, buddy, stuck at work, tuned in to see what's going on, interesting stuff. Thank you, I appreciate you. Good to have you, Alex. Much love. It's gonna be like mid-ground Acryss, I guess? Okay, so yeah. So, here we go. This is all the detail that I'm dropping about the Acryss, generally speaking. So, that's our Bladed Gale. The paragons of the Skyless War, as they are known for. Oh, also, important detail. Remember the way I mentioned that the Acryss are a culture built somewhat on these more Stone Age and animist perspectives? As a result, they often have developed their own totemic sort of traditions. Not like fully totem, but we're talking like actually maintaining artifacts or usually some kind of... What's the word I would use for this? Relics. To tie them back to their culture. So much in the same way that like some people have like the belt buckle passed down from their grandpa, or like I have a knife given to me by my father, which is literally just like a pocket knife. I have a necklace given to me by my grandmother. For a lot of the Acryss, they maintain these relics through the ages as a way to pass down that culture. And so each different tribe has different heirlooms and relics and totems that they maintain that they consider important. And oftentimes, if they lack one, they'll create one. Because again, much like animism in a lot of different cultures, I often think to like Shintoism as an example, there is a tradition that you can create spiritual power and create that connection with time and effort. And so creating a totem, a first generation totem, is quite possible. So for the Bladed Gale, oftentimes they tend to utilize ancient weapons and war mantles, going all the way back to the Skyless War. So, like, it's not uncommon for an Acryss to have anything from a Stone Age Jasta, which is basically imagine a double-headed axe, but instead of designed for cutting, the bearded part is used for acting almost like a hook. It's kind of almost like a Shaolin spade, in a way, if you think about it that way. You could have something like that, literally carved out of stone, maybe gilded or like reinforced with some sort of metal to keep it durable over the ages, or sitting right next to a plasma rifle, or an ancient hard light helm worn by someone's great-great-great-great-grandpappy. It's all right there. It's very possible. MacGuffin. Exactly, everybody's got their MacGuffins. And so for the Bladed Gale, weapons tend to be the one. Weapons and armor, as a tradition, tend to be like the baseline. The next one would be the Lambent Moon. They're also called the Sculptors of Civilization. So for them, since their dawn, the tribe of the Lambent Moon they fought against the outsiders with the Ataraxi, or to say, fought against the Ataraxi with the Anazali. However, the Acryss of the Bladed Gale, being the whole like renowned folks in arms, it was the Lambent Moon who were the skilled diplomats. They were the second group to sign up after the Bladed Gale. And so for them, they maintained the beginning of what we would consider the first treaties. If the Bladed Gale was going to become the first, like, empire, the Lambent Moon was going to become the first, probably, like, political power. Like, actual body politic on the planet, if things continued to go. In fact, they often used their lands as a means of managing interspecies, or I should say not interspecies, but intertribal conflict. They would often serve as a neutral ground for a lot of different other groups within the region. And so you have this interesting flip of, like, you go with the warriors, now you have the diplomats. They're also known very much as being the ones who built what we would consider the Acryss's actual modern-day government, which is known as the Stratocracy. So they're the ones who invented government, in a way, or at least the modern conception of government among most Acryss. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty close approximation for them. So while we're talking about these guys, oftentimes these guys are the ones who keep poetry and records of history. It's not uncommon for them to literally have what we would consider like the equivalent of a pedigree. So anyone who's ever read, I think it's the Book of Job. I think it's the Book of Job that has this. Giant. It's like the list, the genealogy list. There we go. It's like one particular part where it's just like the lineage of Job, where it's the list of all the kings. And it's just, you can read it through, and it's just like a one by one of who they're related to. It's not uncommon for these folks, for these particular Acryss from the Lambent Moon, to have that. To, like, have an actual list that says, oh yeah, that's my dad, and that's my dad's dad, and my, going back hundreds, thousands of years. Those sort of rosters are really rare and coveted. But also things like poetries, famous written words. For many of them, those words become like mottos. So it isn't just that you have and I'm also going to open up on the side over here so I have a immediate facial reference. Always have references, even for your own art. So, like, they'll oftentimes take these words from their ancestors and kind of almost turn them into, like, catchphrases. Anyone who's ever watched Naruto knows exactly what I'm talking about. For the record, I'm also aware that Naruto has the misfortune of the believe it being a very poorly translated interpretation of a Japanese exclamation used for a lot of shit. But the same idea applies. It's not uncommon for Acryss of the Lambent Moon to literally take their ancestors' epitaph and try to apply it to, like, literally everything in their fucking life. If you've ever had a friend who will not stop quoting something, like one particular thing, you've already known a Lambent Moon. So, as far as the Lambent Moon goes, they're known for being level-headed, they're known for being diplomatic, they're known for being oftentimes the ones who will solve emotional and personal problems between people. So, they're kind of the mom friend of a group, usually. Whereas I would say most of the time, like, the ideal Bladed Gale, and again, I'm talking about the ideal, the cultural ideal, not an actual person's ideal. They are, like, the ride or die friend, usually, if I'm being real with you. Which I am. I'm always real on this channel, unless I'm talking about fake stuff, which I do occasionally do. So, who are you? Pulls out scroll and inhales, ready to read. Yes, exactly. Begot Job, begot Jabe, begot Jeb. Oh god, I hope no one knows who begot Jeb. Anyway, so that right there is the Lambent Moon. The next is the Shadowed Canopy. Now the Shadowed Canopy are interesting because, like a lot of species in Legacy, there are certain, like, phenotypes that can exist amongst the different members of the different species. I do my best to try to steer away from racial stuff because, one, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of fucking loathe it. I love a lot of fantasy. I really hate how a lot of fantasy tends to do this thing where they kind of ram people based on their species into a box, and then they kind of go, and here's the biological essentialism reason for all these things. And I kind of hate that. And by kind of, I mean, I hate that with a burning passion. So I try not to do that. However, a lot of these species grow up in extremely distinct environments from our own. And in the same way that humanity has adapted to different regions where they exist, as well as also to different conditions and different life experiences, other species have, in certain cases, literally adapted more in a different way. For the Acryss, they actually have a sub-variety of Acryss, which actually have enough distinction where they qualify as a separate phenotype. There actually is there's literally a scientific scale for how many distinct traits you need to have that separate you as a subspecies and as a subphenotype of an existing species. These Acryss meet that qualification. They go by the term, the loosely human translation of it being nocturne, where for them they are literally nocturnal. As opposed to having a more hawkish countenance, they tend to be more owlish. Their eyes tend to be larger, they have a more fixed facial structure. Think barn owl, same sort of thing. But they're still Acryss. They possess all the same structures, just in different places and in different proportion. So, they're specifically adapted to low-light flight and flying within closer quartered environments. They literally come from a shadowed canopy, in case the name of their tribe didn't give that away. So, for the record, the shadowed canopy are not all nocturnes. Again, it's been 2,000 years. And even before then, these are phenotypical traits that were emerging. They were not perfectly preserved. Not everyone from that culture is Nocturne. And there are sliding scales. I am Puerto Rican. I'm Hispanic. I guarantee you, if you stand me next to someone from Mexico, like, if you put me next to someone from Juarez, Mexico, and you stick me next to somebody who's from Belarus, or you stick me from somebody who's from, like, downtown Argentina, or Chile, I look nothing like them. I'm actually paler than most of my fellow Hispanics. And the same thing goes for a lot of Nocturnes. Not all of them possess these traits in equal measure. In fact, actually, for the most part, it's largely not a thing you have to worry about for gameplay. It's only a trait you can choose to take if your character has expressed those traits more directly or more aggressively than others might have. So, for the Shadowed Canopy, they're known as the Dwellers in the Dark. And this is because the world of Sheer, the world that the Acryss hail from, is kind of like a big cracked egg. So if anyone's ever seen, like, if you ever managed to crack an egg perfectly along its axis, you just get that perfect, and you can open it up and then put it back together again, that's basically what Sheer looks like. There's this huge ring of canyons right around the equator line as a result of a really ancient impact on the planet's southern pole. It was a very weird strike. Not something that usually happens. But it happened to them. And as a result, it caused a massive explosion around its basically its middle. It ejected a lot of debris, and while a lot of that debris did eventually come back down to the planet, it still left this massive, in certain cases, kilometers deep canyon around the middle. It's not even just one canyon, it's a lot of them. It's like a shattered area. And that's where a lot of the Acryss first developed, in these very high heights. Literally flying off of these canyons, off the mountains that arose from this impact. However, the Shadowed Canopy actually live in the valleys, far below, where protected from the sunlight that's a little harsher in these areas, they actually developed thicker, hardier vegetation. A lot of the vegetation in the Acryss's heights tends to be more arboreal, in the sense that it's almost, I guess, spruce-like, or evergreen. It's harsher. The air tends to be a little thinner, and the air also tends to be colder, and less protective against radiation. So you have more hardy plant life up there. But down inside of the valleys, things could develop in a way that you and I would find a little more familiar, in a more, like, I guess, like, what would be the word for it? Subtropical rainforests, stuff like that. So, these Nocturne lived down there, and they more or less survived by avoiding contact with the other tribes. They weren't raiders, they weren't warriors, they weren't great poets or great diplomats. In fact, their biggest skill was that until relatively shortly before the Acryss had arrived, most other tribes didn't even know they existed. They simply saw what was beginning to happen with all these other tribes getting more aggressive on the surface, and they didn't want none of that. So they just stayed low. They kept themselves secret. They're excellent hunters, incredibly skilled at evading detection and tracking obstacles and adversaries, but they largely kept to themselves until the Skyless War, whereupon the Lambent Moon and the Bladed Gale reached out to them and said, "Hey, so far we've respected your distance, but we actually kind of need your help on this." And to a lot of different tribes' surprise, the Shadowed Canopy agreed to fight with them. Turns out most of their isolation was built in fear, and a really reasonable wariness of their neighbors. And given a shared threat, they revealed themselves to be just as concerned with the greater world as the rest of them were. As a result, the Shadowed Canopy became special operatives in a lot of ways. Deciduous. That's the word. You nailed that, Hickory. Thank you. Deciduous. That's right. Didn't Ed and Nettie have that whole thing? Come try a deciduous energy drink. But yes. While the Bladed Gale became the warriors and the soldiers on the front line, and the Lambent Moon became leaders and politicians, for this brute force within a generation, within a decade, uplifting of their species, the Shadow Canopy inevitably found themselves becoming excellent spies, stealth operatives, informants. They were already used to isolation and separation from the other tribes, and preferred to do their business in ways that didn't require consensus from others. So, as a result, they kind of just made themselves useful as many ways as they could. In many ways, their information gathering, if it weren't for them, the entirety of the war effort would have failed. Not even in many ways, most assuredly. There are many who would say if it weren't for the Shadowed Canopy luring the Ataraxi to the huge trap that the Acryss laid for them, they literally blew up a star to deal with the Ataraxi. Which, by the way, if you're wondering how they beat a galaxy-wide parasite, turns out, much like a normal person, if you punch someone hard enough, they go into shock. If you punch a galactic entity hard enough, it too goes into shock. And detonating a star with literally trillions of Ataraxi around it, and also literally hundreds of millions of Acryss who willingly sacrifice themselves for this suicidal ploy, it was enough to put the Ataraxi Scourge into a galaxy-wide state of shock and coma. As a result, they kind of all went dormant. Their hive mind splintered, and the galaxy was saved. And also partly why there's still Ataraxi floating around through space and kind of a problem that we have to deal with in the modern age. But that's neither here nor there. They saved the day! And if it weren't for the information gathering of the Shadowed Canopy, it would have been impossible to track them and lure them there. So, as a result, people who identify as members of the Shadowed Canopy tend to view themselves as discreet, as stealthy. They tend to prefer to view themselves as skilled and cunning, and oftentimes they maintain qualities like being taciturn, being isolationists. If you ever wanted to have if you ever knew that guy in your party at a table, in the tabletop games, who just like made the quiet loner who doesn't want to work with other people, who doesn't trust other people, I'm just gonna get you killed. If you want to make a character that would be right at home, staying next to Hiro Yui from Gundam Wing, then yeah, Nocturne's probably your best cultural touchstone to go with there. However, again, like every other culture, it's in varying levels. Not everything is the same. And, there's plenty of folks who draw their tradition from the Shadowed Canopy and don't view it as a cultural prerogative to isolate themselves relentlessly from their peers. There's plenty that are entirely charitable and friendly and chatty and they want to spend time with you. Again, these are cultural truisms written by the Acryss, celebrated by the Acryss, and much like our own cultural truisms, about as flawed as anything you can imagine. So, Dr. Vanderspiel from Resident Alien would love these guys. All the jokes aside, I like the bird alien design, very cool. Thank you, I appreciate it. The Acryss were, again, one of the first species I actually designed for this role-playing game. I think these guys are pushing... At this point, these guys are the first alien species I think I made for Legacy. Short only of the Anazali. No, the Acryss came first. The Acryss were originally made for a Savage Worlds game that I made, and I eventually adapted them into my own setting. And then, the first species I made solely for Legacy was the Anazali. There you go. Over a decade. Over, actually, 20 years. This was pre-Legacy. This species literally outdates the game. So, I've had a long time to refine the look. Very pleased with how they turned out. So here we go. Really is a cool design. Thank you. Omni knows all about me using outliers and cultures in biology. Yeah, it's fun. They're fun. So yes. Cultural touchstones for the Shadowed Canopy. I almost forgot their relics. So if you're playing the Shadowed Canopy, Acryss, then, assuming you draw your cultural lineage there and you actually give a shit, which many Acryss don't, I'm going to pull you all in for a second again. So, an important thing I want to put out here. One of the guiding principles I had when I was working on Legacy First Flight is that I didn't want to create a Star Trekification of the galaxy. I love Star Trek. However, Star Trek has the really unfortunate habit of oftentimes painting individual species as monoliths. It's not a bad thing because the whole purpose of Star Trek is to be parable. It is literally a very clear lens by which we study our own world. But from a world building standpoint, it does mean that a lot of the species suffer, unfortunately, from one note cultural touchstones. It took a long time for the Klingons to be anything but the pretty stereotypical, like, barbarian, honorable warrior culture. It took a long time for their culture to develop in great depth. The Romulans are known primarily as backstabbers to this day, and that's their primary trait. Even though, really, their primary trait is simply just not wanting to reduce their emotional state for the convenience of others. Dare I say, a pretty reasonable stance. For anyone who's ever known anyone with mental illness, you might know that the idea that someone who has mental illness has to change for people around them is pretty fucked up. And I see a lot of that in the Romulans. And we're not even going to get started on the Ferengi. I love the Ferengi, but holy shit. And so I didn't want to do that with Legacy. I wanted to avoid that as much as possible. And so when you're talking about these different species, and you're talking about these truisms I'm laying out, these are conceptions foisted onto these species by their homeworld cultures. The galaxy is trillions of individuals. The majority do not live on their homeworlds. The majority of the residents of the galaxy live on various colony worlds, settled worlds, terraformed planets. They're scattered across the stars. A great amount of diversity across many shared colonies. It is not uncommon for the bulk of species across the galaxy to have damn near nothing in common with their homeworlds. In fact, a stunningly little amount in common with their homeworlds. When I get to drawing the Shrike, we're really going to lean into that. So just be aware, all these truisms I'm putting out here, they don't have to apply to anything you're doing with your character. Your Acryss could have been born in a colony world, never raised with any of these concepts. They might be aware. The average, more than other cultures, the Acryss do suffer from one particularly nasty thing. The Stratocracy is a military junta. It always has been, it always will be. The Acryss have never quite gotten over that part of their galaxy, their cultural development. Unfortunately, all the revolutions and all the divisions that we've seen that have caused our world to become highly diverse, the Acryss brute force skipped in order to fight in an interstellar war. An interstellar war thrust upon them. And so, unfortunately for them, the Stratocracy operates in many ways like a government in exile for many of its diaspora members. Even if you don't have a direct cultural tie to the Acryss Stratocracy makes a point of keeping track of as many people as it can across the galaxy. It is a military force. And in fact, it is not uncommon for many Acryss to maintain their citizenship when they go to other worlds. However, if they're ever drafted or called upon to serve, they are expected to. Many Acryss, and I'll put the canvas back here, many Acryss across the galaxy do in fact serve in the armed military of the Stratocracy. In fact, mandatory military service is a very common trait for a lot of Acryss. Many spend their first 20-something odd years, and they have roughly a human lifespan, which in Legacy comes out to about 200 years. At this point, it's been 400 years from now. And we've literally gone to space with like 8 alien other buddies who are all inventing their own science and medicine. We're pretty far along that curve. So we've evolved a little bit. We've, not just that, but also like medically modified ourselves a fair bit too. We live a lot longer than we used to. For the Acryss, they have roughly a human lifespan. They spend the first 20-odd years of it in military service to the state of the Stratocracy. So this is an important detail. I wanted to make the different species of the galaxy unique, distinct, but also grounded in the fact that none of them are perfect. Every species has its flaws. And for the Acryss, they unfortunately have a very serious issue with, well, let's just call it what it is, authoritarianism. Their culture is a warrior culture by choice. In any other circumstance, we would consider that a type of cultural whitewashing that steps on, and doesn't step on, but crosses swiftly into manipulation. So for many of the Acryss, they've grown up expecting to go, at least for a brief while, into military service. This does not have to apply to your character. None of these things do. But I wanted to make it so that the Acryss have somewhere to grow. I genuinely believe, and this is in my heart of hearts, that the reason I wanted to make Legacy the way I did, not a perfect vision of a perfect future, but an imperfect vision of a future that could be made better, that is hopefully a little more hopeful than our current present, but is still not perfect, is because I think when we get too aggressively, like, horror driven, when we get too aggressively optimistic, we fail to depict things as they really are. And as they really are is that we have a lot to grow, but we're also not the worst thing in the universe. Humans are constantly evolving. We are constantly culturally growing beyond our old states. I don't think I wanted to make a perfect world. I just wanted to make a world that was hopefully a little bit more open, a future that's a little more optimistic than much science fiction, which tends to very swiftly swing into grimdark nowadays. No shame against grimdark, but if it's all people see, it's all they'll ever understand. I genuinely do think that people are informed by the media they observe. And I think if all we make is really grim depictions of a shitty future, we'll lose on the opportunity to have discussions about how to avoid that in like a really meaningful way. So that's kind of why I am making what I'm making. The Acryss are the second oldest species in the galaxy, and they have some of the worst personal, like, social sins to wrestle with. They are victims of an ancient war that they were forced to fight. They are still building their culture. To this day, Acryss actually have probably the most, I would say, they've adopted religion the most from external sources. It is really common for Acryss to be Catholic, for Acryss to be Muslim, for Acryss to be Shinto, or Taoist, or Hindu, Jewish. They will basically trade in any cultural exchange, and do so because they don't have that sort of cultural depth. It's not uncommon to find Acryss that practice Shrike's religion, because the Shrike have a very strong pantheon and cultural tradition, which a lot of Acryss sort of envy in a way, and will adopt. So in a weird kind of way, you have this ethnocentric subculture, sure, not great to begin with, but underlying that, a species that's very driven to try to do something right, to do something good, that's sacrificed immensely for the rest of the galaxy. And also kind of made it our problem by never letting us live it down. It's like that guy who, if anyone ever knows someone who did sports in high school or college and they were like, yeah, I was gonna go pro! Like, they never stopped talking about the one time that they did the thing. They got that touchdown. They got whatever it is. They really defined themselves by that one glory moment. That's the Acryss as a culture. They define themselves by their ancient fight and by their ongoing service to the galaxy. A service that is not done in bad faith, either. For the record, they truly do, really do mean it when they say they are trying to serve the greater good of the galaxy. They just still haven't reckoned with what that costs them culturally. Their greatest minds have. They have individuals who are on the vanguard of realizing, who have realized long ago what the Acryss have sacrificed. But that's not the majority. So, getting back to the different cultures. We've talked about the Shadow Canopy, the Lambent Moon, the Bladed Gale. The next one is the Soaring Spire, also known as the Priests, Scholars, and Seekers of Knowledge. So, if the Lambent Moon were all the politicians, and the Shadow Canopy became spies for the interstellar government of the Acryss, then we have to talk about the scientists. Because if it wasn't for the Soaring Spire, well, they would have never gotten into space in the first place. The Acryss might have been uplifted by the Anazali and their technology, but it was the scholars of the Soaring Spire who really absorbed it and made it their own. So, way back in the day, the Soaring Spire actually was known primarily for being sages and shaman. They were witches and will workers. They practiced medicine. They studied the stars. They were probably the first ones who, what we would consider, would become, like, explorers. They actually had begun to master the art of sailing, which I know for a lot of you people who are going like, wait, they can fly, why would they sail? We can walk, why would we sail? It gets you places faster, it's easier on the legs, and it's swifter. Now for the Acryss, everything there applies. So for the Soaring Spire, they lived right off the side of an ocean. And they began to study the stars. They began to study how to traverse their world. They developed the first real astronomical charts or equivalents of them. They began to plot their first constellations, and even had begun to master basic arithmetic in a way that was approaching like more advanced algebra. They were starting to develop in a lot of ways in the same way that we see that kind of mathematical explosion that occurs in these cultures, in these early Stone Age, Bronze Age cultures, which launches them generations ahead of their neighbors. When you think about the Mayans and the Aztecs, and the fact that they were literally working out engineering feats we're still grasping today, or the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians who did much the same. We know for a fact that the ancient Egyptians knew the world was round. Yeah, of course they did. They understood the basics of math. And it turns out if you see a shadow curving, you can figure it out. And for the Acryss, or at least these particular Acryss, they drew a lot of their intellect, a lot of their DNA in that same sort of tradition of these ancient scholars on the verge of exploding. Unfortunately, they never got there on their own. When the Anazali arrived at the start of the Skyless War, and basically briefed everybody, the Soaring Spire were the ones who agreed to become the scholars and learn everything that the Anazali were willing to teach them. Normally, the Anazali had a whole thing about uplifting species, but in the case of what would be likely a complete annihilation of the Acryss if the Ataraxi Scourge were to arrive and they were still Stone Age, they rescinded it. They gave them complete access to all their learning. Their empire was already dead. What more did they have to fear, right? And so they let them have at it. The Soaring Spire were the ones who developed the first Acryss starships. They were the ones who developed almost the entirety of the Acryss system of mathematics and physics, engineering, chemical science, all of it. And in fact, they were the ones who mastered hardlight. A feat that the Anazali are still kind of impressed by, because that was something that they didn't think the Acryss would master, and in fact, they have now mastered it better than the Anazali did. Turns out the Acryss see their world a little differently than other species. Quite literally, their eyes work differently. Their ability to perceive light is distinct from others, and as a result, it gave them an edge in manipulating it. It also gives them an edge in flying. So the Soaring Spire weren't just the scientists. They become the naval ratings, the commanders, the admirals. They were the ones who swiftly realized that the ability to fly gave them an edge in aerospace combat and in starfighter combat. They were already used to fighting in an environment where there was no ground. And apparently where there's planes. I didn't even see it, it's so foggy outside. A reminder that even in my tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, Vermont, there's still planes. That was hilarious. Somebody clip that. No, we're not on Twitch. We can't clip stuff. So, yeah. As a result, the Soaring Spire developed all this advanced math. They developed these starships. They became the pilots and the scholars, and they are renowned for being academic, for being curious, inquisitive, brilliant in many ways. They are also known for being somewhat hyper-focused on their tasks. They are known for, in many ways, being driven and perhaps a little too self-sacrificing when it comes to those sort of pursuits. In many ways, they inherited the concept that you and I would consider of the tortured artist, but for them, it's the tortured engineer. And again, I will emphasize, these traits, these tribal lineages, are like horoscopes for the Acryss. They are much like anyone who's ever been told, you're a Scorpio, you have anger issues, or you're a Virgo. You're probably a little too, like, chill. Like, these are truisms made to sound just true enough to be believable. And in many cases, they become self-fulfilling. Much the same for the Acryss traditions. So, the Soaring Spire, for all of their artifacts, which, if the Shadowed Canopy has their cloaks, the Lambent Moon have their books and their words, and the Bladed Gale have their weapons, the Soaring Spire maintains early mathematical tools, oftentimes handcrafted abaci or ancient astrolabes, stuff like that. Those are the things that are often kept and venerated amongst their culture. So if you ever wanted to make an Acryss engineer, and you really wanted to lean into the stereotypical, then yeah, Soaring Spire is your bag. For the record, again, there are other folks outside of those cultures that do that. It isn't purely their domain. These are truisms. Other tribes have their own engineers, and for the record, in the monolithic, I guess we would call it a monoculture, that the Acryss have created for themselves with the stratocracy, there's plenty of folks that buck those trends. Just be aware there's a cultural imperative to adapt and stick to them, which is not particularly healthy. This thing is giving me so much grief. I really gotta work on this pad. I might need to clean it. Alright, here we go. Okay. Good thing I have a new iPad I can dust off and work out. I just didn't buy one, by the way. It just came with our subscription to the internet. So, I might not like Apple products, but if I'm given one for free, you bet your ass I'll use it. So, final tribe that we're going to speak of. Final tribal lineage. The Endless Sea. So, these are the merchants and artisans of the coastlines. So, while these guys were the Soaring Spire became like the admirals, they became the engineers. The Endless Sea are the ones who were the merchants. They became the pilots. They became the massed naval force. Soaring Spire are just the academics behind it all. But the Endless Sea, those are the guys that actually took to the seas the first time. Those are the guys that actually did go out and engaged in trade. They built the first trade empires between the Soaring Spire, the Shadow Canopy, and the Lambent Moon. They probably would have with the Bladed Gale if it weren't for the fact that the Bladed Gale was scary at the time, and so they didn't. But they're known for being adventurous and skilled and intrepid. They're known for being brave in the Indiana Jones kind of way. They're also known for being a little too enthusiastic and perchance a little swift to take on risk in the chase of the new. They often maintain ancient maps and compasses, passed from one generation to the next. That's their big thing. Okay. I really like how that Acryss has turned out. That's damn near perfect for how I want to depict them. So let's get a little bit of color on this dude here. So those are our 5 major tribal lines. At the moment, and this is where I'm going to bust open the actual, lore book. So, the Stratocracy itself, as we would know it. The Stratocracy is more or less a massive monolithic political structure. It is both the military of the Acryss, its governing body, as well as also its, in many ways, cultural outreach. It's led by warriors, almost always. However, it's supposedly a meritocracy. And in a culture where everyone serves in the military, being led by service members is kind of almost irrelevant. Almost. There still are biases amongst them. In addition to that, the Acryss maintain many military traditions that you and I would find strange. As an example, they have a variety of warriors that roughly translates to the term Sky Knight, approximately. These are often in modern iterations clad in hard suits and known for being the vanguard of Acryss strike forces. Elite heavy infantry, but also tied up with a great deal of cultural veneration for their ancestors. They often ape their ancestors in tradition and fighting style. It's not uncommon for Sky Knights to pass their military service on to their children and teach their children to fight in the same ways they do with the same weapons. Often the exact same weapons. For centuries. Moving down throughout the era. I want to pull that plane out of the sky. Get out of here. Why are you circling? It's too foggy for you to be flying right now. So, this is kind of their whole shtick in the military. Because the military is such a big part of their culture. It is truly a whole thing for them. I believe I have it in the lore primer, actually, which I'll open up now. So, let me go to the Stratocracy. Alright. So, as far as the military goes, for the Acryss, there is no distinction between the body politic and the body military. All of them answer to one guiding council, which, and I want to make sure I get this correct, the guiding council is known as the Sky Council, literally the highest and most towering, named because the first meeting of the multiple species tribes, the tribal conference that led to them fighting the Skyless War, was held on the edge of a cliff, and so they literally all stood off of it and spoke. So as a result, to this day, they still do. They literally build their central governmental structure as a tower reaching into space, with those at the very top being those who are part of the Sky Council, which actually peaks into space, believe it or not. It's damn near it's almost an orbital tower. So as far as they go in that respect, it is not uncommon for Acryss to serve in the military, but the military is everything for them. Their economy, while technically separated in part from their military, you are allowed to, as a citizen, maintain a purely private life. If you so choose, you can forego military service. But in doing so, you forego your rights as a citizen. And yes, that is a fascistic tendency. It is something the Acryss continue to grapple with. But merchants often do their own thing. There is a private market, and the Acryss understand the importance of maintaining private enterprise to some capacity in the galaxy. It's a galaxy filled with other species that do that. They would be not well served avoiding at least understanding that they might need to participate in that greater galactic economy. So they allow it. But it's very common for military service to mean maybe you work in a national industry. Maybe you work in a scientific study. Maybe you work in directly helping your citizens. It's very common for social programs to be directly administered by the Skyless Council, by the Sky Council, and the Sky Knights, and their military fleets. It is very common for that sort of thing to be handled in that way. And so, as a result, serving in the military for the Acryss is kind of like just saying you entered public service in some variety, shape, or form. Just as a general rule. I'm thinking I'm going to keep this mostly colorless. I kind of want to add a splash to this dude. So, what color should we make our friend here? I feel like we need something very strong. I usually go for, like, blackbird colors, so red, orange, gold, or I go for, like, blues, greens, purples. Given that the next piece is going to be the Anazali, and they tend to be cooler, we'll go with a hotter color for this. Let's go for oranges. So I'm going to take this. We're going to start with a yellow, and we're just going to start overlaying this. I think 15 is strong enough for what we're about to do. There we go. Now, Acryss do actually possess feathers, much like the birds on our world. But they're basically just highly adapted quills, much like the birds on our world. Their plumage tends to be highly individualized, but it can be customized even further. It is extremely common for Acryss to dye their feathers to more closely represent their cultural backgrounds that they choose. It is really common for individual Acryss to have, like, a family hairstyle or family quill style. They might choose a particular type of ink, or they might have a particular type of cultural touchstone or a legend. One particular Acryss, by the name of Dashta, way back in the day, is kind of a famous Acryss to a degree. He's the first one to work with humanity during their original joining of the Union, and actually fought the Ataraxi directly. Whole story there. We'll get to it when we get to humanity. So, Dashta actually had a tradition derived, in many ways, from a similar tradition of our Phoenix. He became known as a fire feather. It's a tradition where the idea is those who've been burned, oftentimes in Acryss tradition, the presumption of old was if your feathers are burned in flight, usually by being struck by lightning, it means both you've been chosen by the gods or smote by their ancient spirits. It's literally an understanding of nature has chosen you, either for death or glory. It's up to you to choose. And it's usually tied to their actions, but 9 times out of 10, those traits manifest as brightly colored tipped feathers. So, primarily red, yellow, and orange. We would call them phoenix feathers, but they would call them fire feathered. It's a very rare thing, probably derived from ancient ancestors who got struck by lightning, and they kind of just sought out any explanation for why the hell something like that would happen to somebody. And, much in the same way that why does Poseidon manage earthquakes? I don't know, but the bird, the flying guy in the sky probably doesn't. So the guy into the ocean, maybe? Shrug? Which, in fairness, earthquakes were often followed by tsunamis, so I guess that would track. But much the same for fire feathers. It's just kind of an expected trait for those who are born with this. And they're like, yes, it's almost like their feathers are burning. Very much in the modern age, as a result, fire-feathered Acryss will often not just dye their feathers, but cap them in hard light, as a way to sort of take that cultural tradition to its furthest extreme. I kind of like that. It's giving us an interesting yellow kind of splash. Let's take this a little further. We're going to make this more of an orange. There we go. Mostly towards the tip. Almost like it's golden. And at this point, I'm also going to open the floor up if anyone has any questions they want to ask about the different species or about the Acryss. Please feel free. I'm more than happy to. We're getting towards the end of our stream for the day. And I like to open the floor up a little bit. I've been yabbing on for a while. So not a Norwegian blue, but still beautiful plumage. Thank you. Yeah, very much so. Oh, we should probably mention, like, what the actual mechanical perks, since we are currently in the process of developing the game. So, or I should say not in the process of developing, I have been developing for years. I'm just codifying it all down. I have so many notes. So, Acryss, as far as their stats go, every single species in my book has one trait that they have an extra 2 ranks in, and they have one attribute with 2 ranks in it, and one attribute with 1 rank in it, starting. I have no negatives for any species in terms of their attributes. I don't believe that's very conducive, and I personally find it reductive as a game-building mechanic. I would much rather focus on what a species has perfected in terms of their capacity to survive, rather than what they might not be good at. And I think that goes a long way to making the species feel a little better. So, for the Acryss, their biggest buff is to coordination. They are literally flying dancers in a lot of ways. Their species has actual flight. They are adapted for flying and moving in 3 dimensions. And as a result, they can coordinate their bodies in a way that any other species would find damn near magical. They are, in many ways, the Tolkienese elves in physicality. Which also leans into the other side of it. Their secondary buff to stats is actually in might. They are incredibly strong. They have enough strength in their bodies to break human arms with their own bare hands. I think it's a pretty easy gauge. And not with, like, crazy acrobatics or martial arts like we need to use. Nah, just doing it. They're that strong. They're very physically fit, as a general rule of thumb. We're technically more durable than the Acryss are, for the record. But for them, it's coordination first, might second. And their biggest claim to fame is obviously, in case it wasn't clear, flight. They literally can fly. More than any other species, they are the most mobile of them all. Let's get a little bit of... I kind of want to stick with orange, so we'll go with orange here. We'll see how this looks. Okay, I kind of like it. We're going for almost like toucan colors, which I kind of dig. I think it's very striking. We're literally going with fire feathers here. So this is a fire feathered Acryss. Destined for great things. Assuming they want to. There's plenty of Acryss that be like, nah, man, I just want to stay home and play, I don't know, Space Xbox. What console war are we on at that point? Obviously Space Station. Obviously. Clearly, Xbox has been out for a while. I'm never going to make a pun like that again. That was actually a complete accident. I feel embarrassed about it. So yeah, those are the big traits. Flight, true flight, I should say. So not like, oh, they can hover. No, they actually move in 3 dimensions. You can choose how high off the ground you want to be as an Acryss. I also want to take a moment to mention something. This is a personal little crusade of mine. So, we're just gonna... little game design moment. Just pull you all in here just for a second. Guys, don't be afraid to let your players play flying species in your any TTRPG ever. There's this whole shtick around people playing flying species and saying that it's broken. Guys, it's called a bow. Full send. If your D&D game is broken by a character moving off the ground and flying, what are you gonna do when someone unlocks the flying spell? Flight's a basic component of the game. And the game has ways of addressing it at a very early level. The cheapest ranged weapon in the game is not an axe, it is not a spear, it is not a bow. It is a net. And anyone can take them and throw them. Literally anyone. They are a strength-based item. And you can find the equivalent in most other fantasy games. Flight is actually not as great as you think it is. It's incredible, and an awesome ability. Not underselling it. Just treat it for like what it is. An ability. It is a unique mechanism of movement. It will not break your game, I promise you. If your game cannot stand a couple of guys in a, whenever you end up in a fight, like a guy with Earthbind or a couple of bows, You're fine. I promise you, your bounce will not suffer. You'll be A to hell okay. So that's just a personal grievance there. And that's something I approach with Legacy. And for the record, I know it's not imbalanced. Do you know why? Everyone has guns in Legacy. Everybody. Everybody has guns. It's the future. They have guns. So when you fly up into the air, you get shot down. So yeah. It was a pleasure, Alex. Thank you so much. I appreciated having you. So, as we wrap this up, we're officially entering our 2-hour mark, which is actually where we usually tend to cut our streams. This is actually working out damn near perfect. I'm actually going to go onto this level here. I'm not going to use this as an overlay. I'm going to do this as normal. I always make a point of making my Acryss's eyes very bright and vivid. This is just a personal thing. I like doing it. So we're just going to get in there and really get that glow in. My thought process is the Acryss's eyes reflect a lot of light. A lot of light. They're very good at seeing things. So as a result, their eyes often have very vivid, strong colors. Also, and this is a personal thing, I just think it's groovy, if I'm being real with you. I just think it's pretty as all hell. Then I just gotta take this over here. We add a little shadow to the top. We add a little shadow to the bottom to denote where the actual, like, lid is. And then we get a little reflection going on this. Save it, so I don't lose it. And usually you put a little bit on the other side too. And there we go. We have ourselves the Acryss, the first of 8 playable species in Legacy First Flight. So, I'm pretty happy with how this dude turned out. I'm going to be working on this art a lot more over the next couple days to get things going. Probably going to slap this dude in some clothing, got him a little bit of armor, just get him ready to go. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. I appreciate you. I'm going to be doing a lot more Legacy drawing on this channel for the next couple of months. I'm still going to be working on Gentry Delon Ain't No Fascist, my anti-fascist Helldivers 2 webcomic. Don't worry, that's still coming every 2 weeks. The next Gentry comic will be dropping next Tuesday on the 11th. So keep an eye out for that. Treason Tuesdays are still in effect for the foreseeable future. Towards Christmas, I'll probably go on a brief hiatus so I can take some time and work solely on Legacy. But that's still happening. In the meantime, though, for art assets, we're going to be doing a lot more on Legacy. So keep an eye out. Also, if you're interested in seeing more, go check out my Unicorn Head Studios, which is the other YouTube channel I have. It primarily does actual plays of the game. I've been running an alpha, a live alpha stream of my players having fun with it for the past couple of months. But in addition to that, I'm also currently in the process of doing a series of live streams and eventually maybe even live vlogs of game development. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, if you want to keep in touch with me and learn more about what's up and how we're doing, patreon.com/TheLastOmnitect. 1, you're supporting me and helping me actually stay afloat, but 2, even if you can't afford to support me, even just being a free member gets you access to my weekly content schedules and a bunch of interesting behind-the-scenes stuff. So keep an eye out for all of that. In the meantime, again, a huge thank you to all my incredible folks out there. That would be you, my incredible Voyagers. Thank you guys, all of you. This has been OMNI Draws Legacy First Flight. And don't forget, like, comment, share, and subscribe. We're a small channel, and that helps us grow. I'll see you out there, Voyagers. Peace.